Picture this: an island in the Aegean Sea, white cliffs glowing under the sun, turquoise water stretching endlessly. Now imagine that 4,000 years ago, this wasn't just a beautiful vacation spot. This was the center of the most advanced society in all of Europe. Long before Socrates walked the streets of Athens, long before anyone thought marble columns were worth building, something extraordinary was happening here. This is the story of Minoan Crete, a civilization so impressive that when archaeologists first discovered it, they refused to believe the local people could have built it. They were convinced it had to come from somewhere else, somewhere more civilized. That assumption turned out to be spectacularly wrong. And the truth, when scientists finally uncovered it using DNA evidence, didn't just change one story. It shattered an entire century of lies about who builds civilizations and why. What they found hiding in ancient bones will make you question everything you thought you knew about human history. Around 3000 BCE, while most of Europe was still living in basic mud huts, the people on Crete were constructing multi-story palaces. We're talking about buildings with working bathrooms, flushing systems, skylights, vibrant frescoes covering the walls, and storage rooms big enough to rival a modern warehouse. Their largest center, Knossos, looked like someone handed Bronze Age architects a blueprint for a luxury museum and said, "Make this happen." Inside, you'd find grand staircases, twisting hallways that felt like mazes, ceremonial courtyards, stunning dolphin murals, and paintings of acrobats leaping over charging bulls. There was even what appeared to be a wine cellar. These people weren't just surviving, they were thriving. But here's where things turn strange. Despite all this sophistication, the Minoans left behind almost nothing to tell us who they actually were. No records of kings, no epic poems about heroes, not even a simple inscription saying, "Welcome to Knossos." Their society was incredibly advanced, but their identity was completely hidden, and that mystery would haunt scholars for over a century, leading them down paths that were completely, embarrassingly wrong. Without written records they could understand, archaeologists did what they often do when evidence is scarce. They made guesses. Some scholars suggested the Minoans were Egyptians, who traveled north and settled on the island. Others believed they came from Mesopotamia, or maybe Anatolia. A few people even proposed they were survivors of Atlantis, because apparently, if you build advanced plumbing in the Bronze Age, you must be supernatural or extraterrestrial. The confusion got worse when researchers studied Linear A, the Minoan writing system. They could see the symbols clearly, but they had absolutely no idea what any of it meant. It was like receiving a text message in a language that no longer exists anywhere on Earth. Add to that the strange imagery, snake goddesses, elaborate bull rituals, palaces designed like labyrinths. The Minoans felt both familiar and completely alien at the same time. In the early 1900s, a British archaeologist named Sir Arthur Evans began excavating Knossos. He was brilliant, enthusiastic, and very much a product of the colonial era. He studied the ruins, examined the architecture, analyzed the frescoes and engineering. Then he looked at the local Cretan farmers helping him dig, and reached a conclusion that would define the field for 100 years. But you won't believe how wrong he was. Evans decided there was no way the local people could have built something this advanced. He concluded the Minoans must have come from somewhere more civilized, like Egypt or the Near East. He even named them after King Minos, a mythological character from Greek legends, because apparently nothing says rigorous science, like branding an entire civilization based on a story about a half-man, half-bull monster. For over a century, Evans's idea became textbook truth. Europe's first great civilization was basically imported from somewhere else. The locals couldn't have done this themselves, except almost none of it was actually true. Even before DNA technology existed, some archaeologists noticed problems with Evans's theory. The building materials used in the palaces were all local to Crete. The pottery styles showed natural evolution over thousands of years, not sudden foreign influence. The settlement patterns didn't match any evidence of large-scale migration. But without written records to prove anything definitively, these doubts remained quiet whispers, not solid proof. The mystery lingered. Were the Minoans outsiders who brought civilization to the island, or were they locals who invented it themselves? The answer, when modern science finally uncovered it, turned out to be far more fascinating than anything Evans ever imagined. When geneticists finally managed to extract DNA from ancient Cretan skeletons, the results didn't just adjust the old story. They completely obliterated it. Extracting ancient DNA is already extremely difficult. Extracting it from a hot, humid island like Crete is nearly impossible, like trying to recover a document from something that's been melted and destroyed. For decades, researchers assumed the Minoan genome was simply gone forever, destroyed by time and climate. Then came the breakthrough, the petrous bone. This tiny, rock-hard structure sits inside the skull near the inner ear, and it protects DNA remarkably well, almost like nature designed a biological USB drive. Scientists carefully drilled into these bones from Minoan skeletons, processed them through sophisticated sequencing machines, and waited for the results. When the data finally appeared on their screens, the entire field of Bronze Age archaeology had to face an uncomfortable truth. Remember Arthur Evans' grand theory that the Minoans came from Egypt or the Near East? Completely wrong. The DNA revealed something totally different. The Minoans were not Egyptians. They showed zero significant North African ancestry. They weren't Mesopotamians or Levantines. They weren't some exotic mystery population from a forgotten lost world. What the genetic data actually revealed would force historians to rewrite everything they thought they knew. The Minoans were overwhelmingly descended from Neolithic farmers who had migrated from Anatolia and the Aegean region around 7,000 to 9,000 years ago. In other words, they were locals, not visitors, not colonizers, not imported geniuses, just people who had lived in this region for thousands of years and gradually developed into the first complex civilization in Europe on their own. But the plot twist doesn't stop there. The same 2017 Harvard study also analyzed DNA from the Mycenaeans, the people of mainland Greece who would later fight the Trojan War and create the culture that eventually led to classical Athens. The results were shocking. The Minoans and Mycenaeans were genetically very similar, sharing around 70 to 75% of their ancestry from the same Neolithic Aegean and Anatolian farmers. So why were these two civilizations so dramatically different? Why did one produce peaceful dolphin murals while the other produced warriors with spears and chariots? The answer came down to one key difference. The Mycenaeans had an extra ingredient: steppe ancestry. About 10 to 15% of their DNA came from Bronze Age pastoralists of the Eurasian steppe, people who brought horses, chariots, and the early Indo-European languages with them. That's why Greek became an Indo-European language and why Linear A, the Minoan script, is not. The Minoans never received that genetic package. Same roots, but very different branches, leading to completely different cultural outcomes. Thanks to genetic phenotype reconstruction, scientists now know what the Minoans actually looked like. Dark hair, brown eyes, medium to olive skin, typical Mediterranean features. The famous frescoes, showing light-skinned women and red-skinned men, weren't depicting different races. That was just Bronze Age artistic convention. Men were painted darker because they worked outdoors and got tanned. Women were painted paler because they spent more time in ritual indoor spaces. But here's something even more remarkable. The Minoan genome didn't vanish. When researchers compared ancient DNA with modern people living on Crete today, especially in isolated mountain communities like the Lassithi Plateau, something extraordinary appeared. Modern Cretans carry a strong, direct genetic link to the ancient Minoans. That means the Minoans didn't actually disappear when their civilization collapsed. Their palaces fell, their culture changed, but their people survived. Many fled into the mountains, rebuilt their lives, adapted, mixed with newcomers, and endured. And they're still there today, running cafes, farming olives, driving taxis, raising goats, and living ordinary lives. The supposedly extinct civilization isn't extinct at all. Its descendants are standing right there, drinking Greek coffee and going about their day. For over a century, the dominant narrative insisted that civilization must have come from somewhere else. Small islands don't invent big ideas, they said. Local people couldn't have built something this advanced. But DNA proved otherwise. And if this origin story was wrong, what else about ancient history needs to be completely rewritten? We know who the Minoans were and where they came from. But that still leaves the most dramatic question. If they were so advanced, why did they vanish? Because well-engineered plumbing, acrobats flipping over bulls, and excellent olive oil don't usually lead to civilizational collapse. But the Bronze Age had other plans. Around 1600 BCE, the island of Thera, which we now call Santorini, exploded in one of the largest volcanic eruptions in human history. This wasn't a small eruption. It was roughly 100 times more powerful than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Imagine a blast so massive, it punched a column of ash into the stratosphere, collapsed half an island into the sea, and triggered a tsunami the height of an apartment building. That tsunami headed straight for Crete, the very place whose entire economy and defense system depended on ships and maritime trade. In an instant, ports were destroyed, harbors flooded, their fleet reduced to splinters, crops covered in volcanic ash and salt water. Their religious and political order was probably shaken to its core. The Minoans didn't die out overnight. This wasn't a disaster movie where everyone perishes in one dramatic scene. They survived the eruption itself, but their world didn't survive intact. They were weakened, economically destabilized, spiritually shaken. And right when they were trying to rebuild and recover from this catastrophe, guess who showed up to take advantage of the situation? The Mycenaeans. Tougher, more militarized, chariot-riding warriors from mainland Greece. After Thera's eruption left Crete vulnerable, they crossed the Aegean Sea and seized their opportunity. This wasn't a genocide or a complete wipeout. Think of it more as a hostile corporate takeover. Archaeological evidence shows Mycenaean-style weapons suddenly appearing on Crete. Minoan palaces were rebuilt, but clearly under new management and new cultural influence. Minoan elites likely intermarried with Mycenaean newcomers, blending the two cultures together. Genetic steppe ancestry, which the Minoans never had before, finally appears in late Cretan burial sites. The Minoan world didn't end in one dramatic moment. It transformed, morphed, blended into a new Mycenaean Hellenic identity. And that cultural fusion eventually became the foundation of classical Greece and what we call Western civilization. If you walk through the ruins of Knossos today, you see collapsed palaces and ancient history. But if you walk through the mountains of Crete, you see something else entirely. Living descendants. DNA evidence revealed that the collapse of Minoan palaces was not the collapse of the Minoan people. Many fled inland to places like the Lassithi Plateau, high in the mountains where invaders couldn't easily reach them. These regions were isolated, difficult to attack, and perfect for communities trying to escape the chaos happening on the coast. Because of that isolation, their genetic signatures stayed remarkably stable across thousands of years. Modern Cretans, especially those living in remote highland communities, still carry strong Minoan ancestry in their DNA. Their genetic legacy walked right through every invasion, Roman, Arab, Venetian, Ottoman, and somehow made it all the way to the present day. That's not just survival, that's extraordinary persistence. For centuries, textbooks taught the same narrative. Civilization spreads outward from a few great centers, Egypt to the Aegean, Mesopotamia to the Mediterranean, always moving from east to west. But the Minoans proved something completely different. A complex, innovative, seafaring civilization can emerge locally without being imported by outsiders. They didn't copy anyone's palace designs. They didn't borrow someone else's writing system. They didn't import their gods from abroad. They invented their own world right where they lived. Arthur Evans couldn't imagine that local island people could create anything this extraordinary. That bias shaped an entire century of archaeological thought. But DNA doesn't care about biases, egos, reputations, or colonial narratives. DNA simply reveals the truth. The Minoans were Europe's original local geniuses. Their culture was homegrown. Their innovation was real, and their legacy is still alive, walking through Cretan villages today, carrying ancient blood in modern veins.